I don't think the fight has ever actually been between theism and atheism. I really think it's between authoritarianism and pluralism.
Oh. You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up. She is all the way in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm back here in the tundra of Norman, Oklahoma. Later on the pod, Missy and I sat down with Evan Clark, who is the executive director of Atheists United out in Los Angeles, California, and we have a delightful conversation with Evan. It is a really entertaining pod that you're not going to want to miss, so stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well, and you?
I'm a little frazzled.
I can tell. Well, hopefully the crowd can tell that you're not in studio.
Right. They can, I'm sure, because the sound probably stinks, but bear with us. It'll be worth it because I just learned I should not try to disrobe when we're on the Zoom call.
Yeah, the promo video is going to be great this week.
Recording video.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, so yes, as you mentioned, I am not in studio with you. I am in Boston, Massachusetts,
Yes.
because once again, the weather has completely waylaid my plans to fly home. Which is just another plug for people to actually believe in climate change, because this is my campaign platform, that if we will stop climate change, we can stop all of these flight cancellations because of weather events that are directly a result of climate change.
So that's your argument.
Yes.
Okay.
Back to my story
Back to your story.
of why I shouldn't disrobe. So yes, I'm in Boston, thankfully, at a cousin's house, so warm and toasty. But here's the problem. In places like New England, where they prepare for cold, their homes are super toasty warm.
Oh, those old boiler systems, they're terrific.
Right. They are terrific. And so, yes, as I was preparing to record in like 4 layers of sweatshirts and t-shirts and whatnot, I started getting really warm, and I took off a sweatshirt and my AirPod fell underneath the couch, and so it was a bit of a to-do. So I am here. I am fully clothed, but I learned a valuable lesson. Don't take layers
Don't
off.
take layers off, yes.
The couch here, I found 3 goldfish, a trolley car, and some sort of action figure that I don't know what it is.
That's a good haul. That's a good haul.
Here we are.
Oh,
So I am in Boston, Massachusetts. I came up here because one of our sons was having a very minor medical procedure, but it required anesthesia. And so I, as mom, felt like, I should probably be here.
yeah.
Did not feel the same. However,
Well, I mean, yeah. When you're in your 20s and, mom shows up for a little procedure.
right.
I mean, I think he could have gotten that splinter out of his finger all by himself.
So, you know, here's the thing. For 3 days, his meals were paid for.
That was medicine enough. Absolutely.
So I did come up here, and the phrase "no good deed goes unpunished" is just running through my head as I'm now stuck here because of ice and snow everywhere in the country.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if you want to rush back here to Norman, Oklahoma, because we got up to a balmy 11 degrees today. It is so cold.
It's colder there than it is here in New England. However, I will say it's still very cold here. The wind is unrelenting, and it is very cold. So yes, so here I am. I had been in a hotel, ended up moving to I have a cousin up here I'm staying with, and who as a 6-year-old first grader. And as I was trying to figure out how we were going to record tonight an intro and what even we were going to talk about, which actually, shocker, I always have lots of things to talk about. I I asked the 6-year-old, so Wyatt, what's going on at school? What crazy stories do you have?
Oh, please tell me why it had a great story for you.
Content. He doesn't skip a beat. He's like, actually, none of my stories have appropriate words.
6 years old. Love it.
That's fantastic. So he ended up finally relenting and telling me, one, that you'll all be like shocked to hear that Jack in first grade.
Jack. Do we like Jack?
I can't tell this. I don't know, but he did the middle finger at school.
Oh, scandalous.
It was scandalous. But here's the thing that was even more scandalous. He did not even get sent to the principal's office.
Oh, wow. Got away with it. Or got caught, but didn't.
The teacher just said that was inappropriate for school, which she's not wrong.
She's not wrong.
She didn't send him to the principal's office, and we're very upset about this.
Well, it is Boston. So, they teach
Yes,
that in first grade.
That's just a wave,
Right.
which I should tell you our son did on the way to drop me off at the train station today to another driver.
Oh, okay. I thought it might have been to you. Bye, Mom.
That's my office gesture, if you need to know. Yeah, so he was telling me, he was like, I don't think any of my stories have appropriate words. Funny, but anyway, so yeah, I have been marinating on what I said earlier about no good deed goes unpunished. As I came up here thinking I was going to be, mom, nurse, whatever.
Yeah, gonna do all the things, put all the hats on.
Which which it turns out I was just the driver, just the chauffeur, right, and the payer of the bill and all the meals, which is fine. At this age and stage, anytime you get with your kid is good times.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
So between that and then talking to Wyatt, who's our first grader, it just got me thinking about, I don't know, I may have told this before, and I promise this will tie into the interview and to the outro.
Okay, I can't
promise,
wait.
listeners, this will I'll bring it around, tie it up with a pretty bow, right? So in first grade, my mother signed me up for Girl Scouts,
Right?
right? Only in first grade, apparently, you don't get to be a Girl Scout. You have to be a brownie first.
Yes, that's kind of like middle school before you go.
I'm sure you know this, right?
Well, of
You know
course.
about the Girl Scout hierarchy?
Yeah.
So you're a brownie. So instead of the ugly green dress, you get an ugly brown dress to wear,
Hence the name,
which
brownie.
is exponentially worse. I, in first grade, did not wear dresses at all.
Yep, you were a tomboy.
I was, but on brownie meeting days, you had to wear this dress, which I was mortified to wear. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing I learned when I went to the meetings is that you had to wear this Girl Scout pin.
Oh, yeah.
Dress, like a lapel pin kind of. And this is so stupid. But when you went to the meeting, if you had done a good deed, see, again, no good deed goes
right. You said, you did a good deed. What do you do when you get a good deed?
If you got to turn your pin right side up.
Oh, okay.
And if you hadn't done a good deed that week, you had to leave it upside down, right?
Shame. Scarlet letter for the brownies.
It is. So much wrong with this. I'm stressed out about this.
Yeah.
It was very important that you had your pin right.
Very, very vitally important.
So I would spend the day trying to make up some good deed that I had done, right? So I could turn my pin right side
because
up.
I guess I'm talking to your siblings, those were few and far between.
100%. My husband, he could say the same. I would turn my pin right side up, and then we would go around the circle, and you would have to share what your good deed was for the week.
Oh my gosh.
Let me tell
you. Had to do this every week?
every week my sister had fallen and gotten like a boo-boo, and I had gotten her a Band-Aid.
Oh, you're so sweet.
That was the best I could have come up with. It was 0% true.
After about 4 weeks, the leaders are going, "Are you pushing her down?"
And the answer probably would have been yes. But no, it was never the truth. It was just so stressful. It was like you had to do this, you had to do a good deed to put your pen right side up. Anywho, that was what all of this has reminded me of between coming up here to help our son out who, let's face it, he didn't need me
Right.
one iota, and then talking to Wyatt about 1st grade drama. It took me back to that place of 1st grade,
Uh,
feeling like I had to do a good deed. So,
well, I appreciate
this
the
was
brownie story.
which at the end and outro, I promise I will tie this all into our interview today.
I cannot wait how you are going to tie being a brownie, lying about good deeds with our first atheist on the pod. So,
I mean, no, this is brilliant, you guys. I should have been the preacher in the family. 100%.
oh, hold on, folks. This is going to be the Tetris of all Tetris episodes.
I am the Tetris wizard. You know this.
That's right.
Yeah. So yes, we this week we have our first atheist, well, that we know of. Guest. So probably not our first atheist, but our first atheist talking specifically about
Atheism. Yes, absolutely. So Missy and I sat down this week with Evan Clark, who is the executive director for Atheists United out in Los Angeles County. We met Evan in California at an Americans United for Separation of Church and State meeting. He was terrific. We had a great conversation out in LA. We knew instantly we wanted to bring him on the pod. So I hope that you enjoy our conversation with Evan. He is delightful. So stay tuned. We've got a lot going on at Good Faith Media in 2025. New logo, new website, new initiatives. And if you don't know, our new magazine. Good Faith Magazine includes Bible study and lessons. Our new lesson writers are Kathy and Nathan Maxwell, and they host a free, short, weekly podcast in support of their Bible study lessons. In the Good Faith Bible Study Podcast, and it's free. Learn more about the magazine, the lessons, the Maxwells, the podcast, and more at goodfaithmedia.org. Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest all the way from Los Angeles, California. Evan Clark is an award-winning atheist community organizer with over 16 years of experience tinkering with secular communities. He was hired in 2019 as Atheists United's first executive director. Evan is also the Southern California State Director for American Atheist, a board member of the American Humanist Association, and co-host of the Atheist Archives podcast. Evan, all the way from Los Angeles, California, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Evan, yes, thank you for being here. And before we really dig into our conversation today, I want to just take a moment to first extend our condolences to the greater Los Angeles area after the fires last month and kind of check in, like, how are you doing and how are you recovering? And also, how is Atheists United engaged in relief efforts?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Our community has been impacted, not to the extent of some of the churches and synagogues and partners we work with that have literally lost buildings. Luckily, where I live, I was able to escape everything, and I even ran off to my parents in San Diego for a bit just to get some clean air for a bit. And it was wild. I think every community is trying to figure out what they would do in a disaster. And in some cases, the best organized communities have plans and they have systems and they have funds set aside. And a lot of smaller communities like ours, it's the first time we've really had to think about what our response would be, what we would do if we raised funds. So we came together, we raised about $13,000
Wow.
pretty quickly, and we were able to give that out to some organizations that have been working directly, especially with Black families in the Altadena area.
Mhm.
But yeah, honestly, think the ultimate outcome of all this is still to be seen, how these communities can or will rebuild, whether there will be federal funding available. The outpouring of love for Los Angeles has been amazing, but most people have never lost their home in a wildfire before. And and navigating this for the first time, and all of the bureaucracy that comes with that is going to be a community effort for a long, long time.
Yeah, we were out in the Los Angeles, California area a couple of, or I guess actually last month, and we sat down with the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Pasadena, and we were
Yeah.
talking with him. In fact, the video interview is on one of our platforms. I can't remember which one, but we talked to him, and he was talking about how the community has just really come together and
Yeah.
galvanized in this relief effort. And it's like all hands on deck. Everybody's checking their ego at the door, and let's make it certain everybody's okay and headed to a bright future tomorrow. So it was so impressive to read everything that
Yeah.
Atheists United were doing, along with the greater Los Angeles community. Really cool.
Yeah, yeah, it's been really good to see. And I do think it's a learning process for some. What is asking the next question, not just how do we respond, but how do we do it ethically? How do we
Right.
do it effectively? What are the actual needs? One of the mistakes a lot of groups made is they kept asking for clothes. Well, most of the organizations that come to aid work don't actually need that. Most of the people who lost their homes, that wasn't their first request. And so there were hundreds of thousands of pounds of clothes suddenly at every shelter and
Right.
every space around the city. And we all now are hopefully learning for the next disaster about what is most effective, not
Right.
just what makes us feel good,
Yeah.
which is a whole other
That's another podcast episode, I
Yeah,
think.
exactly. Exactly. Well, on behalf of Good Faith Media and Good Faith Weekly, Evan, we are so glad that you're doing well and that the good folks out in Los Angeles are starting the recovery process. But we certainly want to keep all of those who are affected by the wildfires in our thoughts and prayers, and just sending good vibes out your way. Well, we're going to begin. That's how we wanted to begin the pod this week, just making certain that you and your community are okay. But I've got to ask, and I really wanted to start this section out with a joke. What happens when an atheist and Christian walk into a bar? which is
They drink.
which is kind of what literally happened. But here's my question: Evan, you and I and Missy, we all met in Los Angeles when we were attending an event countering Christian nationalism hosted by Brad Onishi. Good Faith Weekly is a progressive Christian organization. You are now the 245th guest on this
Mhm.
podcast. So here's my question. What's a leader of an atheist organization doing hanging out with a bunch of Christians?
Of course. I love this question. Yeah, it's funny. I've been in this atheist organizing space for 16-ish years now. Back in college, I attended California Lutheran University, and I founded the first atheist club on their campus. So I was always in this awkward, semi-liminal space between religious communities and atheist communities. But yeah, there's a need for atheists to have space to organize, to raise kids, to do all of the rituals and meaning making and space making that I think good religious congregations do. And I've been lucky enough to be able to work in that space either as a volunteer or professionally now for a long time. But ultimately, power isn't in atheist communities, right?
Right.
Our society is still culturally and systemically structured around religion often. And the fight for separation of church and state can't simply be an atheist project. It needs to be this continuing cultural dialogue. And I've always been impressed how many faith leaders are on the forefront of that. So while I do think atheists, we always joke we're the canary in the coal mine. We're the first ones that notice everything because everything impacts us when it comes to religion and privilege. Um, yeah, if you look at the history of separation of church and state fights and the history of fighting back against religious privilege in government, you will find amazing religious leaders throughout American history and world history that have literally fought and died for this. And so I've chosen to, instead of stay in my own bubble, to constantly push into spaces and be the kind of interfaith atheist that interfaces and hopefully can bring us all together. Because if we're not in coalition, I think the fascist religious folks sure have a plan, and we're all on the chopping block.
Well, for one, am so glad that you walked into that event out in Los Angeles. I am more thankful that you walked into that bar with me
Yeah,
after the
yeah.
event. We had a great conversation. So,
All right. Well, Evan, as Mitch alluded to, we don't have a lot of atheists lining up to be on the podcast. I think you
That's
are
a
the
shame.
first.
Yeah.
I know, bummer, right? So I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you,
Yeah,
I mean, to give us your testimony, although it
sure.
wouldn't
wow,
really
that
be.
was a good Southern
I
Baptist
know.
line
I
to
was like,
use
well, I
right
have to
there.
throw that in there. But no.
Yeah.
So tell us your story. Just how
Sure.
you kind of came to be an atheist. Do you have any sort of background in, a faith culture like we do, or is this, kind of always been your belief system?
Yeah, I'll say I'm mostly secular in my upbringing. The more I think about, I've been asked this question a lot, and I'm always struggle a little bit with what the language is. I grew up in Massachusetts, kind of a rural Massachusetts town, about 5,000 people, and my parents put me in the Catholic school in first grade, which is very common
Sure.
for a Northeast kid.
Mm-hmm.
My mom's from Massachusetts. My dad is from San Diego, California, though, and I'm pretty sure his family was secular, like pretty California secular, like their religion, their rituals were surfing, truly.
Yes.
But my mom, I think the expectation when she had kids is, of course, if you can, you put them in a Catholic school, and that's how you raise them right. So I went to Catholic school in first grade, but it was not your typical middle of the road Catholic school. I think this was a very intense, like Roman Catholic mass in Latin
Wow.
every morning before school started. And I hated it. And it's funny looking back. I like to
I got news
pretend
for
that it
you.
was
Most
my,
most Catholics hate the Roman or the Latin
yeah,
Mass too.
sure. And I like to think it was my skeptical mind that got me
That's
out
right.
of it.
That's right.
Put any 6 or 7 year old through like daily Latin mass. You have no idea what's going on. You got to dress up in a suit and tie every day. You got to kneel and stand up. And they start the day with like the Stations of the Cross. And you're just like, what is going on?
Wow. I
Uh,
can't
That's
imagine.
I do remember at the same time as I also had a really good science class. Like we had nuns who taught all of our classes. And I remember this lesson where they put a teapot on filled it with water, put it on a burner, and it started to steam. And she started to teach us what molecules were.
mm,
And she's like, look, we know the exact temperature in which water moves from a solid to a gas. And that's because of these things called molecules, which are so small, you'll never be able to see them with the human eye. But with microscopes and science, we've been able to learn that everything in the world and the universe is molecules. And my little brain just exploded. I remember just going, this science thing makes so much sense. And like the fact that we know this much specificity around the world, I just became so excited. And then at the same time, I was the annoying kid asking all the questions about Genesis that like didn't make sense to me.
love
And
that.
trying to in CCD class, like just, the answer was always like, just don't worry about it, just believe it. It's good enough for me. So I was a skeptic, but I also think I just, I had a harsh interaction with the kind of community that I was first put in.
Sure.
And it came to a boiling point where I like my parents let me go to the public school the next year.
Uh,
And so for another year or two or three, they really tried to push for me to stay in the Catholic Church. I was doing CCD programs, but I was being a total prick the whole time, whoever the leaders were. And
but you
finally,
fit
my
right
mom
in.
used to do this. She used to do this thing. If I like didn't like vegetables, she'd be like, "Why don't you just try it one more time? And if you really hate it, I'll let you decide if you ever want to do it again." So she did that with like Brussels sprouts or something when I was a kid. And then she did it for church. She said, "Finish CCD, and if you really don't like it after that, you never have to go to church ever again if you don't want to." And I said, "Sign me up. Let's do it." So I did it. I carried the cross in for the ritual, got the first communion, and that was it. I didn't go to church again until I was in college. I was a proud open atheist, and I was just kind of hanging out with friends, exploring the world at that point.
Well, just give us kind of a broad definition of atheism, just to make sure we're all on
Yeah.
the same page.
No, thank you for asking that. That's actually not asked on a lot of podcasts. So, atheism is a lack of belief in God or gods. I think culturally, we often have what some researchers have called like a theist normativity. We have this like assumption that theism is true and consistent and expected. and everything else is a rejection of that. And from an atheist perspective, there's no religion or no religion. When somebody's born, you find theism or you find atheism. And so similar to like not collecting stamps is like we would call a non-stamp collector, like atheism is like a lack of theism, and this is the hard part, because one of the questions inevitably becomes, is it a religion? It's clearly a religious identity for a survey, but most atheists would argue it's a lack of belief. It's not a positive affirmation of anything. It just says, I reject the ideas that these people are claiming with certainty. With that said, there's a lot of complexity that I can get into after that, of like levels of agnosticism, or whether there probably are some beliefs that we can attach to an atheist worldview. But in its most basic sense, it's just a lack of belief in God or gods.
So tell me, is there a difference then between atheism, humanism, and secularism?
Yes. So there are slight differences. You'll find that there's lots of overlap. So this would be a big Venn diagram usually. So atheism would be the spectrum between theism and atheism, right? So if we could do a nice line, and on one side is the 100% absolute theism is true, I know exactly what theism means. That would be the 100%, all the way down to 0 on the other side, which is atheist, absolutely, like there is no God. And then there's everyone and everything in between, which I think is most of us actually. And humanism is a worldview that has positive affirmations around belief in morality and how the world works. So if you could say there's not just whether a Christian God or a Buddhist God or a Hindu God is true, but whether there is a worldview of ethics and community you can build off of that being their worldview. Humanism has become that for most atheists. And it starts from the premise that this is our one and only life, that everything in the world is physical and can be physically understood. And so anything outside of that, like let's say there's something outside of physics, we would never know it because it can't be measured. And so to believe it or not believe it is insignificant to our life. So we believe in what can be known. There is evidence that when you look at the natural world, there is evidence we live in an ecosystem. And so this ecosystem kind of builds moral responsibility between things. And if I want to try to understand this natural world, what is the best tool we've come up with to figure out what is more true or less true? And the scientific method is the best method we've come up with yet for trying to understand the natural world. So those are some of the kind of core tenets that kind of come out of a humanist worldview. There's lots of different takes and interpretations about where to go from there. Usually hope and compassion and reason are kind of core principles you'll find in most humanist worldviews. But atheism doesn't actually say anything about good or bad, or whether you should care for other humans or not. Atheism's actually usually just a rejection of theistic beliefs. Humanism is usually trying to make claims on ethics and how the world works. And then secularism, that's another one that's going to be usually in like a government interaction, whether government is religious or secular. But what's more fascinating to me than even those definitions is now like building communities around those, right? Like I just told you atheism is pretty much nothing. And yet I run a community called Atheists United.
So glad you,
How the heck do you build a community around nothing, right? And I do think that's where we suddenly have to look at these slightly different, I'm not building an atheism community, just like I think a lot of Christians aren't actually building a Christianism community. I think they're building communities for Christians. And while belief is important in that, practice is actually more important in most churches. And atheist is a political and social identity. And by rejecting religion and or theism in our society, there are different needs that you have. There are social challenges you face. I mean, like family rejection. There are so many atheists that when they tell their parents or their friends and family or their coworkers that they're not religious, they suddenly lose those connections. And so the need for space, the need for rituals, the need for congregation, without a better word than that, yeah, is why we have a place to unite atheists, even though our atheism doesn't actually connect us that much.
What was interesting? Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, Evan, because when we first met, I rushed back to the hotel, looked up your organization because I thought, "Wow, we've got to have Evan on the show." And so, looking at your website, I was astounded about how similar the Atheists United website looks to like my local church congregation website. Because I mean, you've got
Yeah.
things like communities in the community parties, picnics in the park, groups that are recovering from religion. I attend a church that has that same group, I think. And Science Sunday. I mean, you have these programs that
Yes.
are carving out community for atheists. And I thought that was really, really special. In fact, your mission on the website is this: to build thriving atheist communities, empower people to express their secular values, and promote separation of government and religion. So, I mean,
Yeah.
from an outsider's viewpoint, it looks a lot like a church, except the theism is, not there. So, because there is this
Yeah.
incredible
Well,
community there that you're gathering and
the
meeting.
beauty is we have nothing that holds us back historically, right?
Right.
Appeal to tradition is considered a logical fallacy in our community. So there will never be a holy book. There will never be a set tradition that we can't question. And if you look at how Protestantism created so many different types of Protestantism, right?
Mhm.
Like ultimately there was a fight over a tradition or a fight over a very specific way of interpreting either the Bible or a ritual
Right.
that kept breaking into new sects of Christianity. Um, in atheism, we admit that there's no true answer for how to build community, for what to believe positively. And so each community has a ton of power over what they want to do. I've always been a community organizer. I've always recognized that most of the things people do in church, I don't think are inherently theistic. I think they're human. Humans want to congregate with other people regularly. Humans want to raise kids together. Humans want to ask big, deep existential questions about the world, about where they came from, what's going to happen when they die, how they be a good person. And like we have slightly different perspectives maybe from an atheist perspective, but all of the mechanisms for how you would answer those questions or how you would serve the needs of the people in your community, they're so similar. It's ridiculous how similar it is.
Right.
I love hanging out with pastors because I think they understand community organizing more and they're thinking about these questions. I think we use different language. I do
Sure.
think we're trying to interpret this different, but at the end of the day, I think we're ultimately solving the same question, which is how do you support groups of people who want to come to you for these answers, or they want to come to you to connect with other like-minded people?
Right.
I think when you're sick and you're in the hospital, or you're trying to raise kids, or you just got out of a divorce, or whatever the life instance that you're going through is, you need community. It's just so human.
Yeah.
And if we don't create places for everyone on the spectrum of identity and belief, there are people who are going to be lonely and left out and struggling. And it's going to hurt our society. It's going to hurt everybody.
I love that. That was kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about was it just I think many people, especially in more conservative Christian arenas, would think that atheists or atheism is hostile towards Christianity and that there's nothing in common. But after hearing you talk, it's refreshing to hear and also reinforces that there are similar values and goals in these two
Yeah.
kind of if you're going to put two camps, for lack of a better word right now. So, you talked about some of the values that atheists and Christians share, and I love what you said about a moment ago about even in a traditional church, it shouldn't be so much about what you believe, but what are we doing? And so I love that in that community, it seems that there's a freedom from having the litmus test, that
Yeah.
you're just able to go about doing the work of building a good and better community.
And I do think this is the challenge, right? Because the identities ultimately that we build are based on those beliefs, right? Like
Mhm.
atheist is a belief identity, Christian is a belief identity. But yeah, I think most of the needs that humans have are more value-centric than belief-centric. I think you can explore beliefs on your own and not harm people, but if you explore your ethics and practice in the world and you do it wrong, you can absolutely harm people. So the need, I think, is greater there. The event we first met at was co-sponsored by Americans United for Separation of Church and State,
Right.
and most of their leaders have this great line that they use around shared values over shared beliefs. And they're always constantly trying to bring diverse communities together around that concept. And I think when we really live and embody that, yeah, our communities can come together for so many projects. I joke that there are Christian communities that care more about science than my atheist community, right? Like they've practiced support of science more than us, which sounds ridiculous if we were a belief-centric community, but it's a practice. And in practice, when you have the resources and you put the effort in, yeah, like there are people protecting the environment more than the atheists. And I'm like, the atheists, our beliefs would say this is our only world. That environment is completely equal to us. We don't have to shepherd it. Like it is us. And yet, like we see that when we look at values rather than beliefs. I have lots of thoughts on this. I do think there's a huge difference between conservative religion and progressive religion. And I think unfortunately, conservative religion has been able to frame most of the conversation for most of us through most of human history.
Right.
And so the idea that you organize only around belief and that belief needs to be absolute and you should be shunned if you change your belief or question the belief, and faith is the ultimate value, like that's an authoritarian worldview that ultimately leads to you're broken, we have the only answer, and we have the only solution. And the power dynamic that exists between us has to stay. And by focusing on shared values and suddenly centering things like pluralism, we undercut that completely. I don't think the fight has ever actually been between theism and atheism. I really think it's between authoritarianism and pluralism.
Oh,
That's what I was going to say as digging down to the bottom of that in this entire conversation, to me, just control keeps coming back up.
Yeah.
If you're a faith community that comes together because you have similar, a belief in a deity, that's fine. And then you gather in that community to do all the things we've talked about. It's when you start to try to control other people and, like you said, authoritarianism that comes in that things go awry.
And I do think, like there's tons of debate in political science and philosophy about like what is freedom, which freedoms should be most important, because freedoms can clash with each other. But I do think freedom to believe what you want, freedom to dress how you want, freedom to have a deviant identity, like those are such radically important values in my community. I think because historically in most religions they've been denied. So it's interesting when I think 300 years from now what atheist communities might look like. Some might be really strict with dress codes or something, or have a ritual that you can't break from. But right now, there's so many people that are joining our communities who come from a conservative tradition, who have dealt with family rejection, who have literal trauma. And they also are seeing religion used as a political tool to oppress minority identities or identities that don't match that power group. And suddenly freedom becomes the biggest value always. So like we do camping trips and I always start it with like, look, you're adults, you can do whatever you want. Freedom's our biggest value. But if you want, I designed a whole itinerary and we're going to go on some really cool hikes I think you should join us for.
Right.
And we're never going to tell you you're going to go to hell if you don't do XYZ. This is your one and only life and you get to judge how it went.
I love that. Still, one of my favorite commercials on NPR is Ron Reagan talking about he's not afraid to burn in hell.
Yeah. That's the Freedom from Religion Foundation. That's a national org we work with sometimes. Yeah.
All
Always
right.
makes me giggle a
It
little
always
bit. Yeah. Somebody raised very differently than that.
Well, so many great things happening at Atheists United. Evan, thank you so much for being on our pod this week. Again, when we had a chance to sit down in Los Angeles Angeles, I knew immediately I wanted you to have be a guest to help educate our audience, but also talk about all the good work that Atheists United are doing. And you are doing it, my friend. And you can find out more about Evan's great organization at atheistunited.org. It's a remarkable website, and you're going to be astounded by all the things that they are doing out in the LA community. But Evan, before we let you go, we've got one last question that we have asked all of our guests, and Missy has the honor of asking it.
So, Evan, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of our conversation today and the work that you do, what is your more to tell?
I'm going to tell a quick story. I went to California Lutheran University. I started their atheist club. I actually wound up being their first openly atheist student body president, which is a whole other story we don't have time for. But my club that I founded, my best friends came out of that. I had these 2 or 3 really incredible friends I hung out with all the time. And when college ended for us, we decided we were going to go on a road trip of California. And we're broke, we're 22. These are terrible plans that we're just like, we're gonna go. We're sleeping on the floor of a friend who works at a university, and he snuck us into the dorm. We stay at my dad's like old high school friend who's like a diehard Fox News watcher, trying to tell us about reverse racism the whole time, and we're biting our tongue. We camped in someone's front yard. Like, it was this incredible trip. And another friend of my dad had lined us up to stay at their Airbnb in Carmel by the Sea, and I forgot to write him. So it's the day before we're supposed to be there, and we have nowhere to stay. He said, "Oh yeah, I booked that. I booked that weeks ago. You never called me." And so we had just camped in the forest the night before outside of Santa Cruz. We're suddenly a cell signal. We have nowhere to stay. We have no money. It's May or June. Every hotel is full. And my friend has this wild idea. Why don't we just call some Lutheran churches and see what happens? And I'm telling him that's this terrible idea. 3 atheists just calling a bunch of Lutheran churches. 3 hours later, we're realizing we have nowhere to sleep that night. I said, screw it, I'll do it. I call up the first church. No one answers. No big deal. I call up the second one, and I immediately start pleading. Hey, we just graduated from Cal Lutheran. We're all traveling. It's on the road trip of a lifetime. Do you know anyone who might know anyone who might know anyone who has a floor we could sleep on? Guy pauses for a second, and he says, Cal Lutheran, huh? And I'm like, oh no, does he say Cal Lutheran? Did he go to Pacific Lutheran or some other university? And he goes, Cal Lutheran, huh? I graduated 1969. Why don't you come by the church and we'll see if we can help you out. We show up at the church, and he says, yeah, I've got this kid's room with 3 couches. You guys can stay here for the night. You just need to sit with me and answer some questions. I just want to know why young people aren't joining church as much.
Wow.
And for 3 hours, we talked to him and had this incredible conversation. We slept in the church, and we woke up the next morning, and there was 100 people in the church. We had slept Saturday night in the church and didn't realize we were waking up Sunday morning for church.
Oh, no.
And the amount of hospitality and community and love I received has been part of the inspiration for why I think there's so much opportunity and beauty in community, and why we need to work together.
Oh, what a lovely story.
That's an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing.
Oh my gosh, that is terrific. Well, we really appreciate you being on the pod this week, as I said a moment ago, and make certain you check out Evan Clark's work at atheistunited.org. Evan, it is a pleasure, and hopefully you won't be the last atheist that we have on the program, because you were just delightful, my friend.
Thank you.
Well, Missy, our conversation with Evan Clark from Atheists United was just really interesting for me, because I've never had that kind of in-depth conversation, not only here on the pod, but also previously when we met Evan, about his belief system and what it means to be an atheist. He was so kind and so generous, and I really enjoyed talking to him, to be honest with you, and learned a lot from him as well. So everybody was probably sitting through that interview thinking one thing, though: how is Missy going to tie her brownie story to atheism? So, Missy, here is your brown ribbon. Tie away.
Right. Our listener is wondering.
Yeah, little Wyatt, who's listening for Aunt Missy to quote him.
Right. No, so as I was kind of reading more about atheism, leading up to this,
Mhm.
and just I don't know that I necessarily learned anything new, but just some things. Sometimes we don't have language, when especially growing up, for things we're feeling or thinking. And one thing I thought about with our upbringing in, again, evangelical fundamentalist,
Mhm.
belief systems, was everything was about the reward.
Right.
Everything was about, you do the good deed so that you get the reward in heaven. You have to
Jewels
do
in your
this. And
crown.
yes, and it's a checkbox,
Mhm.
and that's the fear. Like, you put the fear in somebody that if you don't do these things, and granted, we were Southern Baptist, so it's saved by grace, not by faith, all the things,
Wow, look at you
yes.
being SBC.
Right? Right? I know, get me the quilted Bible cover, I'm ready to go. Um, it's just everything. It just, when you boil it down, you can't get away from things being fear-based.
Yeah.
You fear going to hell, so you make sure you don't do XYZ, or you do XYZ. You fear, the wrath of God. It's so fear-based. And just thinking of, like, if you're an atheist and you're not thinking so much, you're not obsessed with the afterlife,
Mhm.
right? Then you're making the most of this life in this world, because this is the life you have.
Right.
And that's where we as Christians, as evangelicals in particular, missed the boat.
Mhm.
We're so focused on the afterlife. We're so focused on converting people so that they get into heaven, that we have neglected the here and now. And so that's just something that stood out to me, and my little brownie pen. Like, I will proudly wear my little pen upside down if I need to. But it's just about, what is your motivator?
Right.
And if you are an atheist and you have a moral compass, you're being a good and decent human being, because this is the life you have. This is the time you have to give. This is the world you're given, and you're going to do the best that you can while you're here. And I just wish that for the Christian faith, and in particular for the evangelicals, we could take a little lesson from that.
Yeah. No, that's so important, and I appreciate you bringing that up because I think you're absolutely right from the standpoint Christianity has lost that ideal. When I say Christianity, big C, over our universal church. So the Christian church has really lost that focus of the here and now. Now there are a lot of great Christians and a lot of great churches that are out there, fighting for justice issues in their community, and keep doing it. You're doing a great job. But overall, there has been this overemphasis, if you will, for 2,000 years about the afterlife.
Mhm.
I've got thoughts on that, as you could imagine, that are too numerous to share on this pod. But what we have boiled down to is that the idea of an afterlife, the idea of a heaven and hell, is an incredible tool because, as you rightly mentioned, it is a way to harness fear in people's minds and hearts. And if you can harness fear and instill that in people's hearts and minds, then you are able to control them because fear is such a
Right.
great motivator. And when there's that absence of fear, it is liberating and you do concentrate more on the here and now. And what saddens me, Missy, is that Christians and Christianity for over 2,000 years now have missed the teachings of Jesus when they put more emphasis on the afterlife than they do this world. Because if you'll remember, one of the first things Jesus teaches his disciples when they ask him to pray is that God's will be done where?
On earth as it is in heaven.
Thank
Like, do
you.
it on earth.
Thank you.
Make the earth like God envisions and wants it.
Right. So there is this
So,
emphasis on the here and the now, but Christianity has de-emphasized that, and I think is a lot of the problems that we face today are because of that. But at the end of the day, it is fear based. But what really challenged me, Missy, was that as a person of faith, as a person who calls himself a Jesus follower, the very fact that I have a belief or that I believe in a deity or a creator of what is defined as the universe, just by having that belief, that does lend me to be a little bit of authoritarian. And what really struck me with our conversation with Evan was at the conclusion of our interview, he talked about kind of this false equivalency or false division between atheism and theism, and talk more about the struggle between authoritarianism and pluralism or living in a pluralistic society. And I think he's right to a great extent that that is what we're seeing right now because, I don't know about you, Missy, when I grew up in the 1980s in a right-wing evangelical
In the
denomination.
1970s,
Oh,
actually.
that's the 1990s or 80s. Yeah. I was a teenager. My formidable years were the 80s.
All right.
Yeah.
You can go with that.
Go with that. When I grew up then, I mean, it was like, atheist was not spoken very highly of in those congregations.
No.
It was like, okay, there was Satan that you had to be fearful of. There were the atheist you had to be fearful of because, the whole communist thing over in the Soviet bloc
Right.
countries. And then, of course, Democrats. You had to be very fearful of
Well,
Democrats.
sure.
So not particular in that order, but you get the drift. Get my drift.
No, that was the order.
But what really challenged me about Evan's words was just that authoritarianism that religion itself takes this position, declaring that in many instances it's the only way. You have to believe this. You have to believe this not only to get into heaven, as we talked about a moment ago, but you have to live this way to be fulfilled. And that is the lie, to be quite honest with you. I'm a person of faith because I choose to follow Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, especially his emphasis on justice in this world. But that's my choice. But in making that choice, I agree with Evan that we live in a pluralistic society, and other people don't make that choice, and I respect that, and I honor that. And so I think we are healthier as a country, as a human society, because we're pluralistic. We are stronger out of our diversity, and I don't think that will ever be accepted by authoritarianism.
Well, and that's the other point I was going to make as I was kind of reading today is that, and we've talked about that several times on this podcast about how, again, growing up, how it was very insular, and you can't, to a degree, you can be friends with people who are outside of your faith tradition or outside of your even denomination with the goal of conversion, right? And other than that, you had to be careful.
Mm-hmm.
Be careful.
Right.
And what you and I've discovered as adults is that in what so many people have voiced is that by learning about others, by learning about other belief systems or non-belief systems, it in many ways strengthens our faith.
Yeah.
And so it helps us to be closer to our community, closer to our friends, but also closer to the deity or the God that we have faith in or that we choose to worship. And so we are giving up so much by isolating ourselves.
Yes, 100%.
And that's just not the answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I have never felt closer to God, or I've never felt better as a human being, I should say, when I met people from other faith traditions or other belief systems. Talked about my friendship with Ahmad and Chauncey and, not knowing a lot of Muslims, getting to know him and him teaching me about his faith, or getting to know Jack Moline, rabbi out in Virginia, and now Evan, Clark, who's an atheist. I learned something when I talk to these individuals and learn about their faith and how their faith shapes them, or their belief system shapes them and their ideology. And as we learned from Evan, there's so much more that we have in common with the atheist community than we could ever imagine. I mean, they have the same struggles we do. They're trying to make bills, raise kids, do it all, buy eggs these days. So, I mean, they're just like us.
Probably, now that you're saying this, it makes me think probably because we're evangelical, or we did grow up that way. So the goal was to convert. I guess then the fear part was that the other, however you define that, was going to try to also convert you.
Yeah.
Little did we know that those others out there had no interest in converting us.
Right.
They're like, y'all good. You stay
You
over
can
there.
stay right
you
over
can have
there.
your lane.
That's right. You guys have your little club. Just leave the rest of us alone.
Right. Anywho.
Well, I really enjoyed our conversation with Evan, and again, first atheist that we know of who's been on the show, but he was the delight.
He was wonderful. I really enjoyed our conversation. He's such a great, just a great person and a great communicator. So I hope we get to have more conversations with him.
Yeah, and I appreciate your story, your little brownie story. That was good, and you tied it in well. Very good.
It's also fear-based. Can we just stop with that?
Just stop
That's
it.
my
Just
only
stop.
request.
Just stop. Okay. Well, Missy, I can't wait for you to get back here to Oklahoma. I know maybe one more day, maybe two. We'll see how the flights go out tomorrow.
We'll see. Maybe a month or so. I don't know.
That's right. Well, Missy and I will be back next week. And until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.